Have you had photos that were blurry even though you used a tripod? Well, in this video I'm going to explain what's actually causing that blurriness and a simple step-by-step process to set up your tripod in the field so that you get perfect sharpness every single time. My name is Will and I'm a multi-award winning landscape photographer and photography coach. And in my experience, most photographers think blurry photos are a camera settings problem. But if you strip everything right back, your blurred images are really a light placement problem. I want you to think about it like this. So to get a sharp photo, we need the subject that we're shooting to be still whilst the image is being exposed. We need the light that we want to capture to be focused onto our sensor, and we want the sensor to be static whilst the image is being exposed to. So still subject, focused light, and still sensor, and bam, you're going to get an image so sharp that's going to make your eyeballs bleed. Now, when we put our camera on a tripod to capture a beautiful landscape scene, our goal is to tackle sensor movement. But even with a tripod, well, you can still run into a few issues. So I do a lot of landscape photography up in the hills and the mountains of England, and the higher you get, typically the windier it becomes. And I learned very quickly after capturing a bunch of blurry shots that just sticking your camera on a tripod and hoping for the best doesn't guarantee that you're going to stop your camera sensor from bouncing around. And here's what most amateur landscape photographers don't realise. Even a gentle breeze can vibrate your camera body even when it's sat on a tripod, and often your lens hood is going to make this even worse as it acts like there's a big sail in the wind. So how do we resolve this? Well, there's a couple of things that I do when I'm out shooting in windy conditions to make sure that my camera sensor isn't bouncing around, ruining my shots without me noticing until I get home, put the image on the computer, and I slap my forehead in just pain and embarrassment. And the first thing that I do is I shoot almost always without a lens hood, and this is to reduce the surface area of my camera so it's less affected by the wind that's hitting it. Next, where possible, I'll stand on the side of the camera where the wind is blowing, and I'll try and shield the camera and the lens with my body. And if it's really windy, I'll suck it up and I'll take out the big boy tripod that has thicker, more rigid legs, which dramatically reduces the amount of vibration that my camera has to battle with. Now, don't believe the hype from the tripod manufacturers or the landscape photography YouTubers who are getting paid pennies to promote them when they proclaim how stable their lightweight travel tripods are. You can't beat physics with fancy marketing, and sometimes a big beast of a tripod is the right tool for the job, even if my back and my legs suffer carrying it up and then back down the hill to get the shot. And if you want to hear more real talk about how to improve your landscape photography rather than watching videos where there's some bloke on camera trying to sell you new camera gear to make a few quid in commissions, then make sure to click subscribe. Now, the vibration that can shake up your sensor, which leads to blurry photos, doesn't just come from the wind hitting your tripod if you're out on the hills or the mountains. There's one form of vibration that you are causing, whether you realise it or not. When you press the shutter button, no matter how gentle you are, you're going to nudge the camera slightly and ever so slightly shift the sensor, even when your camera is firmly sitting on top of a tripod. The solution: set up a 2-second timer in your camera settings so that you can press the shutter button and then let the camera settle for a moment before the shutter fires off. The other alternative, if you're trying to capture a very specific moment in time, like a wave crashing against the shore, is to use a remote trigger. I use the standard wireless remote trigger that Sony makes for my camera, and it's crazy expensive for what it is, but it's never let me down. And well, let's say you are shooting somewhere like the beach, you're using a remote trigger, there is zero wind, and you're still getting blurry photos. What could be the next cause of them? Well, on my trip to Lofoten last year, for the first hour of shooting seascapes there on the beach, I kept noticing this really annoying tiny amount of softness to my photos. Now, I was using the big boy tripod, there was zero wind, and I was using a 2-second timer on my camera to capture these shots, but I was still getting this kind of slight smudging effect of light moving on my sensor when the shutter was open, leading to slightly blurry images. And it turns out the issue wasn't my tripod or what was sat on top of it, but rather what the tripod itself was stood on top of. And I fully admit this is kind of obvious to point out, but the fact was that my tripod was slowly sinking into the sand as I was taking my photos, and that's what was causing the softness in the long exposures that I was shooting. Now, I'm not completely thick. The movement in the sand wasn't enough to really notice a change in composition when I was setting things up, and it wasn't noticeable if I just stood and looked at the camera and the tripod itself, but over a 5-minute long exposure, that was enough time and enough movement to lead to a soft image when I went and checked the photos after the fact. So the solution, well, higher ISOs and faster shutter speeds were possible, but I was doing long exposures to blur the clouds in the sky. And so my solution, the only thing I could find that worked, was that I got some rocks, I put them under the tripod feet to increase the surface area that the tripod was stood on, and that seemed to work pretty well. So we've covered the tripod vibrating from strong winds, eliminating the movement that is caused when we press the shutter button, and taking into account what the tripod is stood on top of. But what happens if you're still getting soft photos and you've solved all those potential issues? Well, it might actually come down to a very simple camera setting. There is one camera setting that tends to surprise a lot of the photographers in my landscape mastery training. And if you want to learn all the frameworks and get access to the proprietary tools that are going to help you create the best landscape photos of your life in the next 8 weeks, then click the link in the description to learn more. Now, this camera setting can lead to blurry photos, blurry shots, even when you're using a tripod. And that camera setting is your in-body stabilization, or IBIS setting. And that's because for certain camera bodies, the camera manufacturer recommends that you turn off stabilization when you're using a tripod. Why is this the case? Well, because IBIS works by detecting movement and then shifting elements inside the camera to counteract it, which is fantastic when you're hand holding the camera. But when the camera is perfectly still on a tripod, the system can confuse itself. It can start hunting for movement that isn't there. And this can then introduce its own tiny micro movements, which then cause your image to be blurred, to be soft, especially if you're doing longer exposures. Now, for me personally, with my A7R5 camera body, I've never bothered turning off IBIS when I use a tripod because I've tested the camera with it turned on and I've tested it with it turned off. And there's no bloody difference between them, either in video or photo. But your mileage may vary, and so it's worth doing a bit of a test. You can do this at home, right? So you can do this in your kitchen if you like. Just do a quick test with a few shots of IBIS turned on, a few shots of IBIS turned off, when your camera's sat on top of a tripod, and just confirm this setting for yourself. But what if everything, and I mean at this point, absolutely everything is set up right, and the image is still not tack sharp from front to back? Well, there's one more cause of blurry images, and most amateur photographers, including myself when I first got started with landscape photography, most landscape photographers get this wrong. Okay, so if you've ever taken a landscape photo on a tripod with a telephoto lens, then this has almost certainly affected the sharpness of your images, and it is the effect of atmospheric haze. Because if you're shooting across a long distance and perhaps there's heat rising from the ground, creating a shimmer between you and your subject, or you're shooting far enough into the distance that there is an increasingly dense haze of pollution, pollen, or just general particles in the way between you and your subject, then inevitably you're going to get a softened image because of atmospheric haze. Now, most amateur photographers hate the idea of any parts of their image being soft, and so they'll take a photo that has some natural atmospheric haze, and then they'll use the dehaze slider in Lightroom to try and pull every single pixel of detail out of the image. And well, admittedly, I did this at first too, but it's a bad idea. If you look at any high-level landscape photographer, something that they fight, like proactively fight to work into their photos, is more depth. And atmospheric haze can really help with this because our brains inherently know that more haze in front of an object is likely to mean that that object is further away. So it adds depth to our scene. So embrace the haze rather than trying to remove it from every single photo with massive amounts of dehaze in Lightroom, and your landscape photos are likely to look a lot more compelling anyway. Alright, so you now know why you're still getting blurry photos even though you've gone through the immense physical pain of carrying a heavy tripod to your shoot. But I still see landscape photographers setting up their tripod in completely the wrong way when they get to their location. So how do you set up a tripod to eliminate these issues entirely? Well, step one, before you put your camera anywhere near your tripod, you should work out your composition. So for me personally, I use my phone, I use the built-in camera app, I walk around, move down, up, down, left, right, change perspectives, back, forwards. I will do whatever I can to get the composition right in the camera, in my phone, and then I'll pull the camera out of my bag and I'll make sure that it looks good on my camera too. Then very literally I put the camera down on the floor where that composition works so I don't forget it, so I don't lose that composition, and then I'll grab the tripod from my bag. Then I attach the camera to the tripod, I find the composition again. I will then try and keep the camera as still as possible whilst I adjust the tripod legs to lock the camera in place. And I always start with the bottom legs of the tripod when I'm getting set up, and This is crazy to me, but I mentioned this in a previous video and there was literally uproar in the comments. There were hundreds of people calling me an idiot because Will, surely everyone knows that the bottom legs of a tripod are less stable than the top legs. Well, that might be true if you're using a crappy tripod that some YouTube photography influencer has sold you on, but each of the legs on any decent landscape photography tripod is going to be more than sturdy enough. And the issue is that if you start extending the top parts of your tripod first, you can't bloody reach the end of them, so they become useless to you anyway. So set up the bottom sections of your tripod first, and the goal here is to keep your composition as locked in as is humanly possible. And the reason why this is so important is that it stops you becoming a flat photographer, otherwise known as a photographer who is a fixed lens height angle taker. Because it's always shocking to me when I'm out in the Lake District specifically, because there's lots of other photographers around typically when I'm out shooting, who, without question, they get the tripod out of their bag, they set it up at eye level, and then they plonk the camera on top of it, and then they capture whatever composition just happened to be in front of them. And so they've had no real input to that composition, they're just capturing what is eye level and dead straight ahead. So don't do that, don't be a flat photographer, and find your composition before you start messing around with your tripod. And now you know the ins and outs of using a tripod for landscape photography, watch this video next where I explain the #1 reason that your photos look amateur and the surprisingly simple fix.